The dust swirled around Martha's bare feet as she sat in the middle of Main Street, clutching her torn dress against her chest. The morning sun cast long shadows between the weathered buildings of Cedar Ridge, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out across the empty land. She had been there since dawn, waiting for anyone to notice her shame. Thomas McKenna adjusted his hat as he walked his horse down the dusty road toward town. At 58, he had seen enough heartbreak in his life to recognize it from a distance. The woman sitting in the dirt looked like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. He had been coming to town for supplies, but something about her posture made him slow his pace. Martha heard the gentle clip-clop of hooves on hard earth and looked up through tangled hair. The man approaching wore the weathered clothes of a rancher, and his eyes held the kind of patience that comes from years of tending to wounded animals. She pulled her dress tighter and whispered the words that had been echoing in her mind all morning. "Hold me. Use me. Just get me out of here." Her voice trembled like autumn leaves before they fall. Thomas dismounted slowly and approached with the careful movements of someone who understood that frightened creatures needed space and time. He had raised horses and cattle for most of his adult life, and he knew that rushing never helped anything heal properly. The woman before him reminded him of a mare he had once found caught in barbed wire, hurt and defensive, but desperate for relief. "Ma'am," he said softly, keeping his distance. "Looks like you might need some help this morning." Martha's eyes filled with tears that had been threatening to fall since yesterday evening. The kindness in his voice was almost too much to bear after what she had endured. She had expected judgment or worse from anyone who found her like this. Instead, this stranger offered something she had almost forgotten existed in the world. "I don't deserve help," she whispered, looking down at the dirt between her fingers. "Everyone in this town knows what I am now, what I've become." Thomas crouched down several feet away and removed his hat, revealing gray hair that caught the morning light. His face showed the lines that come from years of squinting into sunsets and weathering storms, both literal and otherwise. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important conversations happened when you got down to someone's level. "I'm Thomas McKenna," he said simply. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles west of here. Been living alone out there for more years than I care to count. What I don't have is any interest in whatever stories folks might be telling about you." The gentleness in his voice made Martha look up again. She saw something in his weathered face that reminded her of her grandfather, a man who had shown her unconditional love before the world taught her that such things were rare. This stranger's eyes held that same steady warmth. "Martha," she said after a long pause. "Martha Henderson, or I was until yesterday." "Well, Martha Henderson or Martha, whoever you choose to be now," Thomas said with the hint of a smile. "I'd be honored if you'd let me offer you breakfast and a safe place to figure out what comes next." The crow that had been calling earlier landed on a nearby fence post and tilted its head as if listening to their conversation. Martha watched the bird for a moment and remembered her grandmother saying that crows were messengers bringing news of change. Maybe this moment was exactly that kind of message. "Why would you help someone like me?" Martha asked. "You don't even know what happened." Thomas stood up slowly and brushed the dust from his knees. His movements were deliberate and calm, like someone who had learned not to rush through life's important moments. He had buried a wife 20 years earlier and raised 2 children who had long since moved to distant cities. Loneliness had been his companion for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to want to care for someone else. "I know what it looks like when someone's been hurt," he said quietly. "I know what it sounds like when someone's given up hope. And I know that everybody deserves a chance to start over regardless of what brought them to their lowest point." Martha felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in days. The weight of shame that had been pressing down on her began to shift just slightly. She had been sitting in this street waiting for someone to condemn her, but instead, she had found someone offering redemption without even knowing her story. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "My husband, he threw me out yesterday after—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the pain in her voice told Thomas everything he needed to know about betrayal and broken trust. "Then it sounds like you're free to make a new choice about where to go next," Thomas said, extending his hand toward her. "My horse is strong enough for 2, and there's coffee brewing back at the ranch. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and safe. Martha stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. She had been taught to be suspicious of kindness, especially from men she didn't know. But something about Thomas felt different. Maybe it was the way he had approached her, like she was worth saving, rather than something to be avoided. Maybe it was the genuine concern in his voice or the patient way he waited for her decision. She reached out and took his hand, letting him help her to her feet. Her legs were stiff from sitting on the hard ground, and she swayed slightly as the blood began circulating properly again. Thomas steadied her with a gentle touch on her elbow, then walked to his horse and offered her his jacket to wrap around her shoulders. The ride to Thomas's ranch passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the morning songs of meadowlarks in the distance. Martha found herself relaxing for the first time in days as the town disappeared behind them and the open country stretched ahead. The landscape here was painted in shades of brown and gold with patches of green where underground springs fed the hardy grass. Thomas's ranch house sat in a shallow valley surrounded by rolling hills dotted with cattle. It was a simple structure built for function rather than beauty, but it radiated the kind of solid dependability that comes from being well-maintained and genuinely loved. Smoke rose from the chimney and Martha could smell coffee and bacon drifting on the morning breeze. "It's not much to look at," Thomas said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it's been home for more than 30 years. The walls are thick and the roof doesn't leak and there's always enough food for one more at the table." Inside the house was clean and organized in the way of a man who had learned to take care of himself and take pride in that self-reliance. Photographs lined the mantelpiece showing a younger Thomas with a beautiful woman, who must have been his wife, and 2 children, who had inherited their father's steady eyes and their mother's bright smile. "Sit wherever feels comfortable," Thomas said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "I'll get you some coffee and we can figure out what you need next." Martha chose a chair that faced the window overlooking the valley. The morning sun was climbing higher now and she could see cattle moving slowly across the pasture, like dark islands floating on a sea of grass. Everything here felt peaceful, in a way that made her remember what safety used to feel like before. Her life had fallen apart. Thomas set a steaming cup of coffee in front of her and took the chair across the table. He had added cream and sugar without asking, somehow knowing that she needed sweetness in her life right now. The simple gesture brought tears to her eyes again, but this time they felt different, less like despair and more like relief. "I used to have a life," Martha said after taking a sip of coffee. "A house and a garden and neighbors who spoke to me on Sundays after church. I thought I was building something that would last." "Most of us think that at one time or another," Thomas replied. "I spent 15 years believing my wife and I would grow old together on this ranch. Had plans for grandchildren visiting every summer and family dinners that would fill this kitchen with laughter." Martha looked at the photographs on the mantel and saw the story written in Thomas's weathered face. Loss had carved lines around his eyes, but it had also deepened his capacity for understanding. He knew what it meant to have dreams shatter and to have to rebuild hope from nothing. "How did you keep going?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. He had asked himself the same thing, many times during the dark months after his wife's death, when the ranch had felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. "At first I didn't think I could," he said finally. "I went through the motions of living because the cattle still needed feeding and the bills still needed paying, but I wasn't really alive. I was just existing from one day to the next." He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the land that had been his salvation and his burden. The sun was higher now, and the shadows were shortening as the day gathered momentum toward noon. "But then I realized that grief and failure and disappointment are just weather patterns in a person's life. They blow through and cause damage, but they don't last forever. The land endures, and so do we if we're patient enough to wait for the next season." Martha joined him at the window, and for the first time since yesterday she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The valley spread before them looked eternal and peaceful, as if it had witnessed countless human sorrows and continued to offer the promise of renewal.